Cool. Okay, so first things first. What I was going to talk about was a little bit of housekeeping too. And what I mean by that is, I had taken involvement with this user group community probably about a year and a half ago. I had worked with somebody over at Adobe that wanted to start this, and I was kind of thinking, maybe we should have like in-person sessions. If not, we can do them a little bit more hybrid. Maybe we do completely virtual. We were talking about it, and I was with a different agency at the time, a company called ICF Next, which you may have heard of.
Yeah.
And we had about 3 meetings last year, which was really they were pretty good. We never really did them in person because I think
Yeah, I attended those meetings and they were like so good. I
Oh, that's
learned a
great.
lot.
That's great. And they were good and they were fun and everything, but they still weren't in person. They were still virtual. And I was really hoping that we would get to a point where we can have in-person meetings again, right? I mean, Summit's back, that's in person.
Yep.
Although it's, technically, I guess it's hybrid too, because there's all the all the content that's available for free, and you can watch it live. And there's some sessions that you would have to be there, in person for, but then they record those and they make them available later. So it's not like you have to pay the Summit fee, but not be able to get the content. So that's kind of nice too. I think that's great. So I'm starting to try to get this going a little bit more. Like I said, in person, I think that would be great. There's another group that I'm working with as well. They're the CXD community, and they're basically on meetup.com. We may have some additional meetings on that forum as well. And it's all going to be on Meetup. They use Zoom, I think. I'm not sure how much they're going to do in person, but I think they were looking to do at least a couple in person sometime next year, and then potentially looking at doing a little bit more than that too, like maybe a conference. We would do like post summit kind of meetings. So we'll see how that goes.
Okay.
Either way, though, I'm trying to open this up, and I'm trying to be have it be more of a community, right? So I want it to be involvement from people who use AEM. Maybe it's people who implement AEM.
Yeah.
People who are selling AEM, right? But that being as it may, more of a community. I don't want it to be like a one-person show. I don't want it to be a one organization show. I want people to participate, and ask questions, and what do you want to learn, and just kind of bumping elbows with other professionals. That's kind of how I want to have this work. So anyway, just wanted to sort of lay that out as a foundation for the discussion. Okay, so I'll get into edge delivery services. So let me just go to our next slide here. Okay, so what's edge delivery services? We were talking about this a little bit earlier. There's been a few name changes with it. I think originally it was called Helix, and that was around for probably about at least a year and a half, 2 years maybe at this point, maybe longer. And then it was called Project Franklin, which I think was named after Rosalind Franklin, who had sort of discovered some kind of something related to DNA. I remember that. I can't remember the exact history, but that's where they came up with that name. And then Next Gen Composability. So that was right about the time of Adobe Summit from earlier this year. And now they're calling it Edge Delivery Services. So there's been a few name changes, as you know. So, you're going to probably hear those all interchangeably. You're going to see that, interchangeably too. I still see sometimes in the code where it says, delivered on Project Franklin. So that's just going to be a thing, I think. So the other thing too that Edge Delivery Services is that it's a part of AEM as a cloud service. So you got to have a license to basically use the Edge Delivery Service, meaning that if you have a live site that's revenue generating kind of thing, that would have to be something that you have a license for. But I do know that with the tools they have for development, you can start developing in it now. You can just go through the tutorial. You can set up your documents. You can set up your SharePoint. You can set up your Google Drive, whatever it might be. Set up your GitHub repository, and you can start looking at content. You can start making changes. So that's a really neat part of it, I think, because you don't have to wait for provisioning. Like imagine in the world of AEM as a cloud service, right? You have to probably come up with a contract, and you have to have the environments provisioned, and you have to go through this whole launch advisory, and all these different things. But with Edge Delivery Services, it seems like you kind of cut all that out. So that's pretty interesting, I think. That's a very interesting way to not only develop, but implement a website, right? And I think, there's a lot of value in that too, because, you cut that development time way down to get your content out there because it kind of feels like it's in the spirit of agile, right? You get stuff out there quicker, you can get some feedback and all those things. So, if you're not familiar entirely, it's, a set of composable services, they integrate with content repositories, and they kind of eliminate the need for having that Sling framework. So, I'll get into that a little bit more detail too, but that Sling framework is something that is the way that AEM works, right? Everything is a resource, and this is a little bit of a different architecture. It's actually quite a bit of a different architecture, in my opinion. So it's really interesting that they've kind of simplified it a bit in that regard, and now we can have this edge delivery services, which kind of gets you up and running pretty quickly. Anyway, okay, so next thing about why you'd want to consider using edge delivery service. So they've always been talking about this, that it's very performant. You get really fast load times, and we've seen that. Obviously, we've seen that with the Google Lighthouse scores of 100. That's pretty amazing. Another thing that the Google Lighthouse scores will tell you too is the things like your SEO, your accessibility. So what does that mean? That means that you can get more conversions from your website, right? Ultimately, so it's good performance is I'm trying to remember. I think there was like there's a statistic that even if it's like 0.1 seconds slower or something like that, there's a report that came out that if your site is even 0.1 seconds slower, then you can reduce your revenue by a certain percentage. Like it was some crazy amount. I forget what the exact numbers were, but it was pretty interesting that they brought that up. And then if you kind of meet the authors where they are, there's less time to get them to ramp up. There's less training that you have to do. Like if they're already working in something like Word Docs or Google Docs or whatever it might be for their content, then kind of meet them a little bit closer to where they are, right? So that helps to speed up your content velocity. That's kind of the idea there too. And then they've been talking a lot about developers too. So they've been looking at the developer persona, and they've been trying to see how can we improve the whole life of a developer as well. So I think they tried to simplify that a little bit. Make it a little bit more flexible. It's friendly for a full stack. You can still have your content and code separation, which is obviously a good practice in general with development. So anyway, that's just some of the reasons why you might consider using edge delivery services. So this is probably something that you both have seen before, which is really the sort of framework and the architecture of how edge delivery services work, right? Kind of looking at it from the bottom right, you can see how you got your different repositories, and you got your content, you got your GitHub, that's where your code is all stored. Maybe you have some AEM authoring, maybe you got some other third-party integrations that are happening. This can all make its way up to this edge delivery service and then render your pages. And again, it's doing it very quickly. It's a little bit different, like I said, than something like AEM. Like in AEM, as you know, there's authoring, publish your content. You can maybe preview it if you have a preview environment. You got your CDN, right? You got your publications that happen via workflows or whatever it might be. And then you have to do things like invalidate your cache, and there's all this, infrastructure stuff that you have to worry about. So a lot of that kind of goes away or gets simplified quite a bit when you work with edge delivery services. So that's, one of the draws, I think, anyway, of working with edge delivery services, that, a lot of that DevOps work sort of goes away, and you can work with your existing web infrastructure, obviously, and there's still some management that you have to do there, but I think it's much simplified, which is kind of nice in this sort of new way of doing things. This right over here, so these two, they're actually two screenshots. If you're familiar with Adapt 2, it's a developer conference which happens usually in the fall of every year.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a presentation that I watched, which I thought was really cool, because they sort of broke it down a little bit more into what is edge delivery services versus kind of what's not, right? So people sometimes confuse them still. They think it's a CDN, but it's not really a CDN, right? So it's a wingman for your CDN, meaning it's a way to help your CDN work the best way possible with your things like you got some things like you got your web application or your WAF, you got your web application firewall, actually. So you got your DNS, you got your CDNs, all those different things, and you get your edge delivery services, which then take care of that rendering and that delivery And, it has frameworks where you can do things like experimentation and personalization. So, that's one of those things I've seen where, you can sort of test out things that, typically would be done by something like Target, right? So that's pretty neat too, that it all has all that, built into it. It's not really editing in Word necessarily, Word is just one of the content sources. So at some point, I think they are going to be, as I said, trying to get edge delivery services to bring in content that's authored in AEM. Or you can also have content that's authored in edge delivery services, but it might be running on something like AEM. So I'm curious to see what that is going to look like exactly. I'm not entirely clear what that is going to look like, because I think it's still sort of under development. So let's see what happens there. And then you got, SharePoint documents, you got your Google Drive documents, you've got GitHub, obviously. So that could be a source of some content as well. So, think like translated labels, that sort of thing. That could be in GitHub. Doesn't necessarily have to be in something like Google Docs. So anyway, so that was just a good couple of screenshots that I took from the Adapt 2 content. This is all available on YouTube as well, by the way. That just painted that picture a little bit more clearly for what edge delivery services is and what it isn't. Okay, so I'm going to walk through a demo then, if that's all right with you guys.
Yeah.
And by the way, I gave some parts of this demo to a group in Minneapolis earlier this year. So I'm going to be, I don't know if you were there or if you saw that, but I'm trying to think. I don't think we recorded it though, so I don't think we put it out on YouTube. But anyway, this one's being recorded, so you'll have the demo and you can refer to it, obviously as we publish that out. Okay, so let me go to my browser here. So I've got, give me 1 second, I'll bring it up here. Okay, so you seeing this okay? Okay, so this is AEM.live. So, I wouldn't be too surprised if Adobe went ahead and renamed it to AEM.live, because, they've been changing the name for this, so many times. But I like it, that's fine. But let's see if it becomes AEM Live. I wouldn't be too surprised, because that's what they call this website, and that's what this is all about. So anyway, that's a good link to bookmark anyway. Okay, so we have in our Google Drive here, we have this NGC demo that we call it, right? And in NGC demo, you can see that we've got a couple of folders in here. We've got a couple of documents as well. These documents are what you can kind of think of as the fragments. So if you have content that's stored for your header and your footer, typically that's an experience fragment, right? So, we kind of have that here too. We've got some nav, and we got, footer content that's brought in. So when we originally did this, we wanted to sort of recreate some of the pages that are on our blog, okay? So we've got some article pages that are out there. So that's where we started. We want to put together a POC on that. So if I go into the blogs folder, you can see I got a couple of different blog posts that are here. So I'll just bring up this AEM as a cloud service blog that we did. So what we did is we basically copied and pasted the content from the blog, and we brought it over into Google Docs. And then we did a couple of things. We created these content blocks, okay? So some of these are for some of the section metadata, and then we just got straight up content. So the content here could be things like your H2s. It could be things like here your H3s, right? So those are pretty straightforward. I think that's pretty simple as far as authoring goes in Google Docs. These actually map to your various HTML elements as well. So it's a relatively simple thing to do to get that to work as far as that mapping goes. But you can see it's just all rich text, and then we got some couple of images in here. Pretty straightforward, right? The other thing that Edge Delivery Services has that is a way to author the content is that it gives you the sidekick. So the sidekick is an extension, and it's available in Chrome and I think a handful of other sort of popular browsers. And when you configure this extension, you tell it where your GitHub repository is, and then you also configure the GitHub repository where you have it. Actually, it's not the GitHub repository, but you tell Google Docs, you share it out with, I think it's called Helix at Adobe.com. So it's a particular email account that's associated so that it can render that content. So once you have that all configured in here, what you can do is you can preview this, right? So when I preview this, what it will do is it will basically take my Google Docs content, and if there's anything that's been updated with the GitHub repository, it will render it out, and then I can view this as, this web page out on the internet, right? So you'll see a couple of things here too. I still have my sidekick, and you can see I got my page, right? It's all looking pretty good. So there's a particular URL breakdown that you gotta sort of, understand here too. So this right over here is actually the main. So this right here is the GitHub branch, which is being used to render this. And I've configured this in the sidekick, okay? This NGC demo, that's the name of the repository that I have for all of this content. So I've got, my GitHub repository, but then I can have obviously multiple branches in there, right? So that's what that is, the main. So NGC demo and main. This is the name of the organization. So we're Perficient Adobe, that's the name of our organization. And then the rest of it sort of ties in with what we have from, we got the blogs folder that I've got in Google Docs, and I've got the AEM as a cloud service. So this is all, sort of the way a URL is structured. So, it's a little bit different than something like AEM as a cloud service, because there you have you get your program, you've got your environment, right? And you've got your content path. So that's how the URLs are structured, is that, again, this right here is all tied to GitHub, and then you've got the rest of it, which is tied to your Google Docs, okay?
Where is the sidekick? Sorry,
Sorry, what was the question?
Is it okay, or should I ask questions at the end?
You can ask, yeah, please interrupt. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to know where the sidekick is.
This right over here is it's like this toolbar.
Oh,
there. And it's kind of tricky because, and here's the sidekick. It's like it's an extension in your browser. But you'll see here that the sidekick comes up. I can just close it out here, and then I can see the whole page. Sometimes that sidekick will sort of get in the way of some of the content that's displayed if it's like, sort of way up on top of the page. And sometimes you can't see that. That's just sort of how the sidekick has been behaving. Maybe they'll put a fix out there where it sort of bump the content down at some point. And I can bring the sidekick back up. There's configurations with the sidekick. So, if I right click on it, I can go to options. And then here you can see this is the project that I'm tying it to, and I'm telling it that my content is coming from Google Drive. So when you first set this up, it'll ask you, where is your GitHub repository? What content are you pulling in? And then you're good to go, basically. So this is the sidekick configuration. You can have multiple projects here. You can, share by URLs. You can add your repositories manually. You can specify a couple of buttons that show up on there too. So again, this is just a Chrome extension. So it's out there. It's available. You can install it to get you going. So Sidekick is kind of cool too because it's extensible. If I wanted to, I can add additional buttons here, which is really neat. And I've actually done that, and I'll show you that in part of the demo with how this works, where I'm pulling in content from AIM as a cloud service and bringing it into my page. But anyway, the thing that you'll notice here too is that see how it's HLX and then it's a dot page. So the dot page means that I'm in like a sort of a preview mode. So if I wanted to see this live, okay, I can just publish this content out. And what it will do then is it will bring up this page and see how it changed the dot page to a dot live. Oh yeah, that's always great. That always happens in a demo, right? Let me just refresh. Okay, all right, looks okay here now. But anyway, I had the dot live here. So that tells you that it's a dot live website. So similar to here in AEM, so they got a dot live, right? Okay. So that's how you can kind of tell that it's your live page. And then the other thing I can do here too is if I go to edit this, then it will just bring up my Google Doc again. So see here if I edit it, just brings up that same Google Doc, which is kind of cool. So the other thing I was going to just mention too with the Sidekick, as I said, it does have integrations where I can bring in content from AIM as a cloud service, for example, right? So let's just say I'm in here, I'm on my content. Let me just enter and say I want to bring in an image, right? So I can go to my assets. So when I click on my assets, what it does here is that it goes to, and we got a sandbox, we've got assets out there, and it will browse the content that's in my assets repository, which is kind of cool, right? And then I can bring in, an image. So if I select it, it copies it, and then it brings it into the page, which is kind of cool. I like that. You can see the little, eye here too. So, that just gives you a little bit more information about that, like the path, where is it? Gives you some metadata about that. So, it's just kind of neat that, it actually does that. So I, kind of like that too. I think that's pretty good. Let's see here, what else? Let me just close that. I think I did copy. I'm trying to think if I had to paste it in or not. I didn't think I had to. Oh yeah, here we go. So I pasted it in. So it copies it and then you paste it in and you get your image, in your doc. So there's another way to configure the Sidekick too, so that you can sort of widen it a little bit more and you can see like a content hierarchy, so you can see the folder structure of your assets. So that's another way that you can view it too, which is kind of neat. Just a different way that you can configure it. So that's kind of nice. So now if I can preview this, then it should show my image. So let's view that image. And then what I'm going to do next is I'm going to run it through a Google Lighthouse score and see what happens. Okay, so yeah, so there's my image. So that looks pretty good, right?
Yeah.
No problems there. Okay, so let me publish this. I'm going to make it live now. Okay, so no issue with that, having problems with the service, so that's good. So I'm going to close this out. So what I want to do next, and I'm also using a Chrome extension here, is I want to run this through Google Lighthouse and see what kind of a score it gives me. So I got the extension set up here. I click on Lighthouse. I'm going to say generate the report. It's going to take that page. It's going to run it through a whole bunch of tests and then give me a score. So let's see how that turns out. Takes a few seconds, not too long though.
Sure.
100. Hey, that's not bad, right?
Mhm.
I would look at, yeah, and I would look at some of these too. I would look at things like accessibility. Like there's probably some tweaks that I can, put in the code, for example, like here, links do not have a discernible name. Heading elements are not sequentially descending order. So that just means that there could be some content cleanup, right? Obviously this is a really good, reference for the performance of the page, but there's no reason it shouldn't be. This is a blog post, right? I think most article kinds of pages or marketing landing pages, I can't see why they shouldn't have really good scores in terms of just content rendering. Like they should be really performant pages. There's no reason they shouldn't be. But at least I think with edge delivery services that certainly helped make that happen here. So that's pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. Right. Any questions before I continue with the next part?
No, I don't have anything.
Okay, cool. All right. So the next thing that we did, we had done this with some blog pages, right? You can see that here. So one of the other things that we wanted to try then next was, what if we wanted to do an integration with like a commerce backend? So what we wanted to do is we wanted to say, hey, let's build out a product page. Let's build out a product listing page and see if we can get that to work. So initially, before we can get to having like an Adobe Commerce backend, we just wanted to pull in some JSON and see if we can get it to work. So JSON meaning like there's a site out there where you can go and retrieve just some dummy content and it's product information. And at least that helps you do the development work so that you can sort of stub it out a little bit and make sure that your product page is looking pretty good. So we did that with a couple of pages here. So let me just show you that real quickly. We have a folder here called product, and we put a couple of products out here. So you can see there's like various products in here. I think when I did this demo earlier this year, I created a new one with a fancy hand clutch. So let me just show you how that's broken out. So you can see here, there's a product, and this is an actual page that retrieves some JSON for me. Okay, so there's dummyjson.com. There's products, and there's like I think 100 products that will give you like just random content. So if I go check this out, if I open up that page, you can see here I've got typical kinds of things that might come from an endpoint, right? Your ID, your title, description, a price, rating, right? So all these different attributes, and then it's also got a list of images here. So that's pretty neat, right? So we decided to, build out these product pages where they're retrieving content from this JSON, and then we're going to render it on our page, okay? The other thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to add these content blocks and make it look more like an actual product page. So we created this tabs component. We've got, a couple of little pieces of metadata in here, just some text. So pretty simple, straightforward product page, right? So let me bring up the Sidekick again and I'll preview this. And you'll see what it looks like. Okay, so there's your fancy hand clutch. So it brought in the title, got a description, right? It's got some specifications. So this is the stuff that we added in the Google Doc, but the rest of it, like the image, the name, the rating, the price, this discount, that's all coming from that JSON, right? We didn't have to do anything to, author that. So, that was one proof that we wanted to do. Let's just create a product page. So the next thing that we wanted to do was let's tie to an actual Adobe Commerce backend, right? So now it's going to be a little bit different because we're not going to be pointing to JSON anymore. Now we're going to be pointing to a GraphQL endpoint, right? And we're going to be interacting with that particular endpoint and continue on with that integration. So that's something that we did too. But before I continue that, let me just double check this Google Lighthouse score too to make sure that it's good. So
Sure.
click on the Google Lighthouse. I think it's the dot page, but let's see. I think it might still work. Doesn't necessarily have to be the dot live. If it does, then I can change it.
Okay.
All right, 98. That's not too bad, right? It's still pretty close to 100. I've seen some websites that we've looked at that are like in the 40s and 50s. I mean, just terrible. And I think a lot of times that can happen because it takes a long time for them to render. And it could take a long time for them to render because they're including too much in terms of things like JavaScript and too heavy of images, and maybe it's not distributed appropriately, things of that nature. So I think that again, the Edge Delivery Services kind of helped us out here with getting us a high score just based on the infrastructure of the framework itself. So that was pretty good. That's pretty exciting, I think. So again, the next step is let's take a look at integrating with Adobe Commerce. So that was our next thing that we did. So let me just close these out. I'll go back to my folder here, and I've got my product list. Okay, and I got an index there. So that's an index page that just brings up like a product listing.
Sure.
So let me just double click that. Put that up for editing. Let me bring my sidekick back up. Okay, and I'm going to preview this. Okay. Just make sure it's the right one. I think so. Okay, nothing's showing up here, but I'll tell you why. My sidekick is configured to point to the main branch that we've been working on, but we actually were working on another branch, which we created, which is called Commerce. So I'm just gonna talk about a couple of things here. So now I got this Commerce branch. So that's a different branch in my GitHub repository, which is now rendering this page, right? And it only didn't work at first because I have my sidekick configured to go to one branch. Like I think you can only go to one branch at a time. You might be able to set up additional projects that are different branches in your repository, but if you think of it from an end user perspective, usually, an authoring perspective, usually you're not going to want to have authors switching to different branches, right? That starts to get to be a little bit complex. They should probably be only working in something like main or, whatever branch is appropriate for what you've released out to the authors essentially. So okay, we've got this Commerce branch, and now you can see this content. This content is coming from that GraphQL endpoint. Okay, so this is not coming from dummy JSON or anything like that. So this is real. This is a real catalog that we created in Adobe Commerce, and it's bringing this content in, which is kind of cool. If I go into one of these, so here's a product page. Now, we don't have this integrated with a shopping cart. That's one of the things that we are working on. So that's kind of one of the next steps that we're doing. We're doing a bunch of other things too. We're integrating this with things like analytics and AEP and, but the main thing I wanted to prove out here was, hey, let's, point to an Adobe Commerce catalog and let's see if we can bring in some of that content. So that was one thing that we wanted to do. The other thing that we wanted to be able to do was also, like you got this description that's coming in, but what if we wanted to make a tweak to that description without having to go to Adobe Commerce, right? Well, we did that too, actually. So, if I just go back, I think we did it with this Galaxy over here. Yeah, see, so what we did is that we actually, brought this particular product into Google Docs. We created a page out of it with this name, this Galaxy 2, and then we customized the description from there. So that way, we actually, sort of augmented to the content that was coming from Adobe Commerce with the content in Google Docs. That's, the other proof that we wanted to do there. So that worked out well too. And then, like I said, we're kind of in the middle of working on some of the actual cart integration, which brings me to another point. Adobe, when they, heard about this particular user group meeting that I was facilitating, they, were interested to know, what I was going to, be talking about. And I kind of walked them through some of these details. And what they said was that they've been working on a boilerplate in GitHub. So it has some of that cart functionality already, which I thought, oh, great, that's fantastic. Like that's less development that we have to do. So they're still working on it actually. So they're still working on some of that, some of that repository. I saw that it's been updated, even recently, like as of today. So they're actively working on it. And I think that once they get to a little bit more of a, completed state with that, then, we'll start to look at it a little bit more closely and see how we can maybe integrate some of that functionality in terms of working with Adobe Commerce. So they also gave me a few other pointers too. They said, well, if you really want to build out some of the cart functionality, you can look at Luma. So that has like a full blown, sort of commerce experience that's built into it. It's not just a catalog, but it's also cart in additional functionality. The other thing that they had mentioned too was that they're going to be making more updates to not just the to the boilerplate, but there's other things that they're working on in terms of building on an experience from Adobe Commerce where you're going to have like these sort of drop-in components. So I'm really excited about what they're working on there. So it's not GA, obviously. You probably want to get in on a VIP program to understand a little bit more about what that functionality is. But it's pretty exciting, kind of what they're working on there. So I'm really looking forward to that. Anyway, so just wanted to point out that that's kind of where we are on this journey of building out these different proofs with these integrations. Any questions about that before I continue on?
No, I think I'm good.
Cool. Okay, so go to the next thing here. So just a little bit more of our learning. So we go back to the presentation.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, talking about some of the things that we learned, right? People have asked about this too. Is it a static site generator? Not exactly, right? Because you just saw, like, we were doing the different things with the sidekick, and we saw the content rendered right away, which was kind of cool, right? So the stuff gets updated pretty quickly. I don't really think I need to go through making a code change. I mean, you see that. I mean, that happens about as quickly. That happens pretty quick too. There's a bot that listens for changes out in the GitHub repository, which is pretty impressive. We learned that you can use some of the content from these documents as a sort of a headless CMS. But as you saw too, we're generating full HTML pages, right? So it seems that it's kind of like a CMS where you can incorporate structured content, but also you can have it unstructured as well, right? If you have Word documents all over the place. I don't have it listed here, but just talking about that, you can also manage things like think about some of the work that gets done in Dispatcher. So things like redirects, you can manage those in something like a spreadsheet too, which is kind of neat. There's a good amount of functionality that they do that's in the sort of DevOps world as well. The content's not stored in AEM yet. Not that we're trying to kind of see where Adobe's going with that. And I think there's a VIP program that might be available that talks or starts to explore that a little bit more. So that's one thing that we're interested about is where are the lines of AEM, what's an AEM versus what's an edge delivery services. So we're looking at that too. They've got this real user monitoring service that checks your site for visitors real world. They got their own status. I didn't show you guys this, but the content that you have that's displayed out there on your site. Let me just go to it quickly.
Yeah.
So let me go to just bring up product again. Let's look at a MacBook Pro. I'll preview this. Okay, so there's a MacBook Pro, right? Really cool. this is what's kind of neat. So if you know a lot about AEM, you might be familiar with things like selectors, right? So if you do .md, then it shows your page in Markdown, which is kind of cool. So this is what's actually being used, behind the scenes with all that, all that fast rendering, right?
Okay.
So that's pretty neat too. The other thing that you can also add to it is a plain.html. That just brings up your plain HTML here too. So it's kind of interesting. I think that's kind of, a neat way to, sort of do this rendering where you can, see, you can probably troubleshoot a little bit easier. You can see your content. This is the kind of stuff I think that is pretty, it's fascinating, the way that, it's pretty nice. Yeah, it's pretty nice the way that you can sort of retrieve your content in these different ways. Maybe you can have it, render in such a way where you have a different front end, for a different experience, right? So that's pretty interesting too. I think that's pretty neat. Anyway, okay, so let me go back over here to my deck. Yeah, so .md, .plain.html, pretty neat. So you can also manage your metadata in a metadata spreadsheet, which is pretty neat. Sidekick is extensible, meaning that you can add your own buttons. One of the things that we saw when we were talking with Adobe was when they were showing us a website that had commerce integration, Adobe Commerce integration. One of the buttons on the Sidekick was a product selector, so you can actually browse a product that's in commerce and then bring in content from that product into your page. That's pretty neat. The other thing that you can do too is you can do sort of like a time warp sort of a thing. So you can set a date with a date time picker in the Sidekick, and then you can see what your page will look like on a certain day. That's pretty neat too. I kind of like that. So the other thing that we learned too, and this is kind of what the direction is that they're going with, but I don't know if you've heard about Universal Editor, but Universal Editor is this sort of authoring tool that they're looking to implement, which basically sort of makes your backend content management system agnostic, right? So it doesn't care where you're getting that content from. You can always author in the same sort of experience. There's headless authoring and there's document-based authoring that we were just doing. So they're just trying to be, very mindful of authoring because they want the, to be flexible. They want them to be able to create content, a little bit more at scale, and they want them to have choices. So, I think that's pretty cool too. The only thing that might be an issue with something like that is, like I said, when you have a rendered page, where is this content being authored? Like, where do I have to go track down, either Google Doc, or do I have to go into AEM, or do I have to go to some other service, right? So that could start getting a little bit fuzzy with, at least I think it can start getting a little bit confusing as to where all that content's coming from exactly. So anyway, we had also asked in the forum the question about, AEM serving edge delivery services and vice versa. So they said that, you can basically have a mix of those. They're looking at having, something available with the VIP programs, like I think I mentioned that before. And then they're probably looking to put together that documentation. They're going to have it generally available sometime in the first half of next year. So let's see, maybe in time for Summit. So I'm looking forward to that too, to see what that architecture looks like. So again, I don't think AEM is going away. I think it's going to be complemented by this, and you can kind of decide what content is appropriate for being served up by edge delivery service versus AEM. So I think that's the direction that we're going. Okay, so this is just a little bit more about, what I don't know all about, but I'm curious to learn a little bit more about it too, because, we're all kind of in this journey. So they have what's called a site importer. When we created the content for those products and for our blog posts, we just did a sort of a manual copy paste into Google Docs to create those pages, right? Which is an option if you don't have a lot of pages, but if you have a lot of pages, then they've provided the site importer tool. So it's a command line tool, and you can tell it where your website is. I'm not entirely certain if you just tell it like a root level, and then it will pull all the content, kind of like what like a crawler will do to import that all into Google Docs, or if you have to be explicit with each page. I'm not sure. So I haven't had a chance to play around with it yet, but I would like to. I mentioned the Adobe Commerce integration with this boilerplate that's in development. And they got this, these drop-in components that they're going to be putting together. So it's going to be a lot of, different features that they'll make available with the use of those drop-in components. We talked about this just a second ago. AEM sites bringing in edge delivery services content, vice versa. One of the concerns that I've heard too from people out in the community is, that, do I have to have my GitHub repository public? meaning can anybody go see my code? When I asked that question, they said that actually you can have it be set to either public or private. So I think that addressed that concern a little bit there too. So that's, probably good. I'm curious to know how development costs are going to be shifted or reduced. By how much and how exactly is that going to happen, right? Like, do we now all of a sudden have to worry about, putting more investment into front-end development, or do we have to put investment into something else? And, what kind of changes is that going to make? I'm sure people are going to be asking those questions. I also like the idea that you don't have to wait for environment provisioning, right? So, you can get up and running, just by going through the steps that they've listed out and their documentation. You can do that like today, so that's pretty neat too. I like that, all that's available right now. As I said, you don't have to wait for AEM's cloud service provisioning with environments and authoring and published instances and all that. I mentioned the sidekick, so that's pretty extensible too. So I look forward to seeing, a lot of updates to that. Another thing too that I think we want to figure out is, what about logged in state? Or what if you have like complex security kinds of requirements? How will that work exactly? That's just one of the considerations that we've been having too. So, say that you had some content that, you were in certain groups and, certain groups can see it, certain groups can't, how does that start to, kind of make things a little bit, muddy in terms of what a user can and can't see? Does that mean, integration with, an internet or not internet identity provider? So, those are the kinds of things that I'd be curious to find out a little too. Can we use it for an intranet? Is that something that's available? Potentially, I don't know. So that's, just some of the questions that we have and stuff that I want to, try to learn a little bit more about. I imagine that you have some questions there too. There's some things that you want to learn more about too, in terms of, the delivery of edge delivery services. Anyway, okay. So I got some, and I'll share this out too. We have some additional resources. So there's, you have a reference to what are some of the other sites that are running on edge delivery services. They have a, a number of them at that GitHub address. I mentioned Discord. That's a really good resource too. You can actually ask Adobe people, questions right there. There's a screenshot that I put on the right. As I said, they got, different authoring meetings and they talk about, various topics. So it's pretty good actually. So it feels like they're, they've really reached out to the development and user community to, address questions and kind of talk about things and, help people on their journey. And they're available on YouTube as well. So you can definitely check that out. I think I showed this URL to the aem.live/home. So there's just some, additional content that you can see. It's like their official documentation. So you can certainly have a look at that too. Yeah, it's kind of more developer of a resource, but obviously, there's other content there too. Like if you needed to know from an architectural perspective, it breaks down the anatomy of a project. So there's some good stuff there too. Also, the next thing I have here. So next thing I was going to talk about was our next chapter meeting. Wow. So, this is really, like I said, I wanted this to be, more about community. I wanted this to be for, people who may want to participate. I think would be great, so, do we have opportunities for speaking engagements? Do we have opportunities for, hosting it somewhere else? Maybe we get some sponsors. Maybe we get Adobe to sponsor some of this. Maybe we can have it sponsored by, the big names like Microsoft or whoever. We had also put a poll out there in one of our last meetings, which was, what are some of the topics that you want to see? So I actually grabbed a screenshot of the topics that we get from that too. So there's a lot of content that we could talk about, right? There's, just so many things. The reason that I wanted to talk about edge delivery services was that seems to be like sort of a hot topic nowadays. So I'm kind of curious about what, where they're going with that. I think that's going to be big too, because, they're probably targeting, what they're going to present at Summit. And, they're probably trying to, get that done as quickly as possible so that they have, a nice polished presentation for that. So that's what I'm looking forward to as well. But like I said, we had 3 meetings last year, that's just a listing of the meetings that we had there. So pretty good participation, Yeah, I'm looking forward to, having more of these, obviously. It might be of a different forum too. So it might be Zoom and I might be, coordinating with the meetup group, we'll see what, what we end up with that. Probably going to try to extend it to different cities. Like that's one of the things I was wondering, should Chicago be just Chicago? Or do we expand it to Midwest, and should Minneapolis be separate? Should Detroit be separate? Should New York be separate, and so on? So I'm kind of trying to still think about, how we're gonna, foster that journey. So we'll see. We'll see. Give it some time. We'll have our holiday break and then we'll
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much, Doug.
see how we go on. So anyway, that's all I had as far as the deck goes in the presentation. So did you guys have questions about it or anything else that you wanted to kind of dive more into? Is there anything more I can show or anything there?
Yeah, thank you so much, Doug. Yeah, I've been talking, I think Prem.
Esther, I have one more question, like how the custom redirects will work here. Like normally, if you go with the normal way of hosting, we'll have Apache and we can put custom redirects, right? So how will it work over here? Did you get a chance to try on that?
Yeah, the way I understand redirects work is that, and there's some documentation about this, but actually, maybe I can bring it up. But the way I understand it is that you have a spreadsheet which can manage those redirects. Let's see where it is. Somewhere in here, redirects right here. So you can have a spreadsheet and you can indicate, the source and then, where it needs to go to. So they got source and destination. There's somebody who actually asked about, how can I have something that goes from, something that ends in a trailing slash and you just take out that trailing slash and it just goes to, that
Actual page. Yeah.
that like an index for that particular, folder. So, Adobe was there. I don't remember what the exact answer to the question was, but Adobe had provided some information about, that particular scenario. So, it's kind of nice that they have that, like I said, Adobe, engineers readily available to answer some questions for you. So that's kind of cool. But anyway, this is, what you do. You just configure a spreadsheet for redirects. You guys have other questions? Is there anything else I can try to address here, talk about?
And with the documents, like while we are mapping with the actual content, do we need have any standards to follow certain structure or like because like while you're showing some document, I saw like you have some table and constructed and you put like it is section by section wise, right?
So are you talking about like within a page?
Yeah, within the page. So your page is mapped with some document, right? So we should always follow the same standard or setup like what they suggesting, or like we can put the content in any format we want.
That's a good question. I think that if you wanted it to look a certain way, then you probably have to come up with a convention so that the author knows that, hey, if I want to have, for example, some image and then text on the right, that'll be one underlying, it'd actually be a style name. And then if I wanted to have it swapped where it's like, image on the right, text on the left, then it would be a different style name. Like that's just a very simple example. So my thinking is that they would have to know what those particular values are because these content blocks are what drive all the sort of mappings between styles and the content that's in there, right? Now, one thing I can tell you is that see how, I put some rich text in here. I made this a bigger text and I also, made it bold. Okay. So let me just show you this example real quickly. So you would think that this right here might show up in the website with this particular attribute set to it, right? But it doesn't actually. So it strips out that additional formatting and it makes it look like, just like the rest of the text.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
So there's no like additional, formatting that you have to worry about there. So, I think that's probably on purpose too, so that it's simplified a little bit and you give, kind of, very, very specific instructions for the authors. You give them this list of styles that they can choose from when they're building up their content blocks, and that's it. They don't have control of layout really, unless you do it with style. So that's one of the things that we noticed too, is that, authors are, they don't have as much, well, I mean, in AEM, you might be able to restrict them a certain amount too, right? They can only do so much in AEM, with their components. What if you only give them 2 components to the policy? That's all they can work with. But for something like this, you would have to, like I said, work with them on what those design elements are because, they don't have control over the layout. So they couldn't change it.
Yeah, that works. Yeah. And if I have one more final question, is this GitHub repos publicly hosted? Do we have access to see that, or like,
The GitHub repos?
yeah, the code that you're currently showing to us?
Yes, actually. So let me go back to my presentation. Second. Okay, so I mentioned that there's these sites that are built from, see, I'm not signed in. So there's these sites that are built from GitHub, right?
Mhm.
Second, I was just getting a call. So let's see, let me think of a good example. Let's look at repositories. Famous Smoke Cigar Advisor. That's a website apparently, right? The public site, I can go in here and I can view their code.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
Like some of it's AEM, right? I can look at their blocks and I can see how they configure their blocks, for example.
It's more look like the AIM core components. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of like AEM core components. I mean, when you have the boilerplate, you get a couple of blocks out of the box, and you can configure those if you want, and you can also add your own blocks. But it's really nothing too complex. It's pretty straightforward, I think. You just copy a block and then you make appropriate changes for it. But I think what's important is the naming convention, because these names here have to match what the block is when you're working in the Google Doc. Okay. So for example, here in my MacBook, see, I got product, right? I've got tab. So, here's metadata. So it has to be a certain name for it to work correctly.
It's like a kind of component name mapping. I got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm able to correlate with the AIM one. Yes.
Yeah, just like that. Cool. More questions? Anything else I can answer here? Like, what do you think? Like, is it something that you would consider looking into a little bit more? Or you want to put together a proof? Like, would you take part in the VIP program? I'm just curious, like, what your take is on it.
Actually, I want to try more on this because we tried this like 2 years back, but that time it's like very early stage. We don't have this much functionalities. We didn't able to get with redirect, custom hosting, caching. Nothing is works. But now it's I'm seeing like it's a more mature like product. So I want to try some hands on it, like how it looks more.
Yeah, I would say definitely revisit that.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more resources available too. Like I said, there's that Discord channel that's out there, which there's a lot of Adobe resources that can answer questions. So it's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Yeah. Now I'm saying actually while you're showing like they have asset integration, they improved a lot. Like
I'm sorry, what was that?
I'm saying like now they improved a lot, like because you have the AIM assets integration, you can bring in the assets from AIM to here. So many good things like the commerce integration, because earlier stage they didn't support for the custom APIs. A lot of things are there now.
Yeah, that's right. And
Yeah, maybe after watching this, I'm more excited to see what in it now.
Yeah. And like I said, I don't know everything about it either. We're still learning about it as well. And I'm curious to find out more things about for example, the site import tools. So, how does that work exactly? And how can I get a lot of content brought in bulk, right? And batch it out. I think that'd be pretty interesting too. So that's one of the things I'm thinking about, seeing how that works.
Yeah, we have to see how like migration works while moving from other platform to here. Yeah.
Yeah. What does that look like? I think that'd be really interesting too. Cool. All right. What else? What else can I entertain?
That's all from my side, Raf. Yeah.
Cool. Okay.